Good afternoon, everyone. It's really wonderful to see all of you, and I just want to say thank you so much for spending part of your precious weekend with us and our panelists as well. My name is Hui Min, and I'm the curator of the exhibition that's currently on view here, Cheong Soo Pieng, Layer by Layer. I really want to take a brief moment to really thank my colleagues from the curatorial programs team for making this event possible. Erica, Jack Ying, Kalisha, and Hannah, you guys have been a wonderful support, and I'm really very grateful. Before I invite my fellow panelists to join me, allow me a few minutes, as it were, to set the scene a bit for today's discussion. I think for many of us seated here, Cheong Soo Pieng needs no introduction. And as you join us today to really consider the question of exhibiting Cheong, we want to acknowledge what seems to be an interest since his passing in 1983 to somehow introduce him again and again and again, albeit in slightly different contexts and areas of focus. What really is it about Cheong that makes him so exhibitable, or rather interesting as a kind of subject for exhibition? The remit of our discussion today will really circle this question of the exhibition and its role in producing and shaping knowledge about art. How does the exhibition, its strategies of display, choice of focus, artworks, and supporting material really convey a narrative that is conceived by its curators? What is the gap between curatorial intent and the understanding of our visitors? How do we engage with the exhibition catalogue and the subsequent discourse generated from it? And what emerges out of the repeated exhibition of a single artist, like Cheong Soo Pieng? Soo Pieng himself, as we can see on the screen here, was probably acutely aware of the power of the exhibition. In his lifetime, he staged approximately 20 solo presentations of varying scale and intent. The images that I'm showing here on screen underscore not only his incredible productivity as an artist, as well as giving us a glimpse into his wide range of artistic materials, but also capture a rather pivotal moment when an artwork is viewed, appreciated, interpreted, critiqued, beheld by someone else. The regularity with which Cheong put together showings of his work, as well as the many cities he achieved this in, was really remarkable for an artist of his time. From his first solo exhibition at the British Council in Singapore in 1956, to a seeming desire to return to his roots in China in the 1980s, Cheong's consistency in exhibiting his works really speaks for itself, particularly after his decision to resign from teaching at the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts to become a full-time artist in 1961. So in the years since his passing, institutions, curators, commercial galleries have really attended very closely to Cheong's vast body of work and delved into different aspects of his practice. It is this appraisal and perhaps reappraisal of Cheong's work that we really want to reflect on today. So I want to draw your attention to the first image on the top left of your screen, where in 1983, Mr. Choi Wen-yang, artist and curator, presented a retrospective on Cheong at the National Museum Art Gallery here in Singapore. This was the first major exhibition since the artist's passing. A staggering 220 works were on show, across mediums of oil, Chinese ink, watercolor, sculptures in clay, wood, and bronze, metal reliefs, and sketches. This extensive presentation within the context of a national institution was a critical testament to Cheong's importance. It was also a comprehensive introduction to the breadth and depth of his practice. And I just want to pause here to acknowledge Mr. Choi Wen-yang, who is with us today, and I hope we have the opportunity perhaps to hear from him later as well. So it was not until the 2010s, as you kind of move down the road, that exhibitions enabled Cheong's work to return to public consciousness, with those held by the NUS Museum, the National Gallery Singapore, and the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts. With this flurry of exhibitions and impressive publications produced since then, we really find ourselves at a moment where we're able to look back on this extensive network, right, of those who have built and shaped knowledge about Cheong. And it's not just curators and art historians and academics, but I really wanted to flag that artists too have really responded to Cheong and joined us in this conversation. So take, for example, this work by Sokari Zulkifli, whose research and presentation of proximities allowed us to question the agency of artistic subjects, and in doing so, reappraise the gaze of the artist. Or Michael Lee's Mapping Places, which, as a commentary on Singapore's efforts to project itself as a cultural hub in Asia, borrowed its imagery from a lost mural by Cheong that was commissioned in 1964 by the Tourist Promotion Board. So in this way, any discussion or presentation of Cheong and his work really becomes part of this very multivalent conversation, something that my own experience curating layer by layer really began with. It was incredibly daunting to be faced with the impressive tomes of exhibitions past, critical essays, and seemingly endless citations and critiques of and about the artist. What were the merits of revisiting Cheong in the format of the exhibition? But buoyed by the relatively novel approach of including findings from the realm of conservation science and material analysis through a framework established by conservator Diana Tay, who's also with us today, the exhibition, which I hope all of you have had the chance to see, chooses to focus on the artistic process as a mean of accessing the artist's work. But really, where do we go from here? How do we continue thinking and writing about the artist as knowledge about his use of materials and process enters alongside a discussion about style and composition? Does such an approach disturb or enhance how we perceive the aura of the completed work? I'm really looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists on some of these questions and much more in our conversation today as we reflect on their own experiences thinking about and presenting the artists. So I'll now briefly introduce my fellow panelists and, as it were, their entanglements with Cheong. So Bridget Tracy Tan worked on the most recent institutional retrospective of the artist, Soo Pieng, held in 2013 at the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts, where Cheong himself taught for close to 2 decades. Alongside the strong representation of works by the artist across his career, the exhibition also showcased many of his sketches and drawings. Seng is our Director of Curatorial and Exhibitions and Senior Curator here at the National Gallery. And in fact, his research interests into the exhibition histories of Southeast Asia make him a wonderful participant in today's discussion. Eugene curated Cheong Soo Pieng Bridging Worlds in 2010 alongside Grace Teng. Incidentally, this was the first exhibition held by National Gallery Singapore before our current building was even inaugurated. The comprehensive exhibition, which was held at the premises of the Singapore Art Museum, was accompanied by a rather authoritative catalogue. Notably, the exhibition also featured items from Cheong's studio. Eugene has also contributed his thoughts on Cheong in other contexts, including an essay for the exhibition Master of Composition, held at SCPI in 2019, which was curated by Xie Zhiyan. Zhiyan and Grace are both also with us. In the same year as the retrospective held by the National Gallery Singapore in 2010, the NUS Museum presented Encountering Cheong Soo Pieng, curated by Ahmad Mashadi and Karen Lim, with the support and advice of Kanaga Sabapathy, who I am now pleased to introduce. So Kanaga has really devoted his life to the research, documentation, and support of contemporary visual arts in Singapore and Malaysia for 4 decades, and I think for many of us here really needs no introduction. He has really written countless articles, books, catalogues, and artist monographs, making invaluable contributions to the study of art in Southeast Asia. But in relation to today's discussion, Kanaga collaborated with curator and artist Reza Piedasa for the exhibition Pameran Retrospective Pelukis Pelukis Nanyang, which was held at the National Art Gallery in Malaysia in 1979. Piedasa, as curator, brought together works by artists associated with the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts, including, of course, Cheong Soo Pieng, who you can see here on the right image, was represented by 14 works. And we can see here the full list of works that were shown in this exhibition. As one of the first times a list of these so-called Nanyang artists was presented, the framework of this exhibition is one that has been, by the standards of those who, if you're like me, spend countless sleepless nights thinking about how to define Nanyang in art, a rather lively point of reference, but I think also contestation and debate. Stepping beyond the confines of the solo artist exhibition, I'm really very much looking forward to hearing Kanaga's reflections from the crucial perspective of the thematic exhibition. The context of the 1979 show, its conception and subsequent presentation in Malaysia, is a really meaningful point of reflection. Indeed, how Cheong has been positioned both during and after his lifetime is really fascinating. Variously referenced as Malayan, Chinese, Singaporean, and Southeast Asian, Cheong is an artist whose lineage and legacy was and continues to be claimed by many. But Kanaga has also written and thought deeply about Cheong for many, many years, attending to the particularities of his artistic style and approach, and considering the question of Cheong's so-called influence through the voices and practice of other Singaporean artists. And that's something that I also hope he'll be able to illuminate for us shortly. So with that, please join me in welcoming Bridget, Eugene, and also Kanaga to join me on stage for a conversation. Thank you. Okay, so thank you, all of you, for joining me on stage. And I really think we want to keep our discussion today really very informal, sort of like a conversation. And, while of course I have questions for all of you, I think also feel free to ask each other questions and ask me questions. So I think after our conversation between us, we'll also be sure to find some time for questions from the audience. I'm sure you have a lot of burning questions to ask us here. But really, as a way of opening, I want to invite each of you to really think back on your respective experiences, either presenting or writing about Cheong. And we're going to go in reverse chronological order. So Bridget has the honor of going first. Yes.
Okay, I'm a little bit nervous because I see there's some notes here, and I understand that Kanaga has some slides for you. So I think maybe can we go to the slides? I did no such thing. I didn't prepare any notes or slides. And I think what I want to just say first off is when we think about curating, or when I think about curating an exhibition, the first thought is that I want to try and best reflect the artist's experience. So where this exhibition is concerned, it was a big challenge because the artist was not around. And being, working in an art school, for me, it's a privilege to be able to speak to practicing artists and to try and understand and access their lived experience. And then, of course, we accommodate all the other things, like social history, history in general, art history, cultural history, and so on and so forth. So this was the biggest challenge, that he was not around to talk to. But again, coming back to trying to look at the artworks and wanting to best reflect his lived experience. So how did I do that? I had to do a little bit of research on his biography, meaning his life, where he was born, how he came to Singapore, what he did, and then match the dating of the artwork, the chronology of the actual production to those times, and knit together a story about this particular artist and how when he produced his artworks, that reflected his lived experience. So it's kind of, we use the word contemporary, and people think, oh, contemporary means super modern, contemporary art, nothing to do with it. But when we say contemporary, we mean just with the times. And that's usually how, when I think of curating a show, that's usually the approach that I take. So in this particular exhibition, there were a lot of works. And what happened was a collector of, can I say his name? I can, right? A collector, Mr. Koh Xiao Chuan, had all of these artworks that, and it's a huge volume of works. We're talking about 900 to 1,000 artworks. Really wanted to do this show, and you notice that 2013 is kind of like a little bit morbid, but it's like kind of like the 30th anniversary of on the year of his passing from 1983. But he had approached me before then to look at this body of work and to see if we were able to put together a comprehensive, if you like, then known as a comprehensive retrospective, as it were, of the artist's practice. So I had the luxury, I have to say, a lot of work, but the luxury of being able to look at very many works and select the works to match the premise that I wanted to convey. And that's really about it. I mean, I can't, it's very hard to explain without a lot of photos of the exhibition, but it's historical, it's chronological. And actually the last thing I should say is, working in an art school as well, I trained as an art historian. I like visual. Okay, I want, when I put together exhibitions and arrange the artworks, I want to encourage people to see and visually apprehend and visually appreciate the artwork in that space. So what do I mean by that? We take it for granted. Many of us who've traveled around the world, or Mona Lisa, or, okay, I'm sorry, I'm naming all these Western works, but, okay, for example, and you think, okay, that's the work, you know what it looks like on a computer, and you take for granted this is what the work looks like. Then you go there, you queue up, you look at the work, and that's it. Okay, I've seen it. Bye. You pay a lot of money, then you go and see it. And for us, and for me personally, putting an artwork in a space is really an opportunity to encourage people to really, really look at the work, to really look at it. So by that we mean, I don't just put one work in one space and that's it. Of course, whatever, and this is the nature of curating. When you put one work there and then you put another work there, there's a mode of comparison already. So without going into all these details, I think you can see the general premise is that you visually apprehend the work and then you start to make comparisons to not only, I mean, it's a very complex thing, seeing and visually apprehending and visually appreciating. So all of these things, when you arrange artworks in a space, is really an opportunity to encourage people to look at that particular work and then to look at that particular work in relation to other works. So yeah, that was the basic premise of. Is that okay? Yeah.
Yes, very okay. Eugene, please.
Yeah, thanks, Hui Min. And first of all, I'd like to thank Sabapathy and also Bridget and Hui Min. I think it's a wonderful occasion for us to share a stage together. And as Hui Min said, our curatorial lives have been pretty much entangled with Cheong Soo Pieng in many ways. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to really share this exhibition histories, as well as our kind of thinking about, in some ways, the futures of how we can think of Cheong Soo Pieng and present him differently. So I'm going to start slightly differently about my exhibition that I co-curated with Grace Teng, who is also here, and also with Adele Tan, because she was involved in the commissioning of 3 contemporary works by Vertical Submarine, Chun Kai-Feng, and Michael Lee. That was part of the exhibition, whereby we asked and commissioned these 3 artists, Vertical Submarines and Artist Collective, to respond critically to Soo Pieng's practice. And so today I'm going to start with a review of the exhibition that was published in 2010, after the exhibition opened, of course. And we rarely talk about exhibition reviews. which I think is important, right? And in this case, it was published and written by Lim Kok Boon. And he published it on his own website, which is titled Boon's Cafe. So feel free to Google it. And you just type in Cheong Soo Pieng Bridging Worlds, which is the title of the exhibition that I co-curated with Grace in 2010. And you type in Boon's Cafe, and you'll find his exhibition review.
Yeah, sorry, can we clarify that Kok Boon is also an artist and educator? Yeah, I think this is important.
Yes, and still an educator today. So he wrote, and I'll just read, because I think it's a good summary in some ways of the exhibition. And I quote, "So this exhibition is significant in many ways. Firstly, it charts the chronological development of the artist's methods and styles, oscillating between figurative and abstract, impressionistic or cubistic-like oil paintings and Chinese ink paintings. Secondly, it explains the importance of drawing as an art fundamental. The artist's sketches are confident and decisive, forming the crucial composition before the colors are added. Thirdly, it reveals the curiosity and exploration of alternative materials such as woodblock prints, impasto painting, and scrap metal relief, often overshadowed by his outlined ink-like svelte depiction of Balinese women. Fourthly, by displaying artifacts and books collected by the artist, it divulges the artist's Western art influence, evident from the European art catalogues he must have read. Lastly, by commissioning contemporary works to insert into the exhibition, the curators took a calculated risk to inject more relevance and appeal." Unquote. I really like the last bit about calculated risk. So I think it summarizes what the exhibition was striving to do. But I think if you put it all together, the curatorial intention was to focus on Soo Pieng's artistic process, which was why we started from drawings and sketches by Soo Pieng. So I'm very glad to also see and I remember the whole body of drawings and sketches in Bridget's exhibition of Soo Pieng in 2013. The focus on process continued throughout the first floor of the exhibition. It was actually 3 floors at the Singapore Art Museum, followed by a timeline and a small section. If you go to the next slide, please. So this was kind of like from the first floor going to the second floor. And this is the timeline of Soo Pieng, and we also included a very small section in this very sad corridor of Soo Pieng students, and including Ng Eng Teng, Tay Chi To, and other artists who studied at the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts. And as you go up the stairs, the timeline continues. It's quite a fun timeline. Also, it's not a timeline about just text, as what Bridget shared. We wanted it to be more experiential, and that was kind of a similar objective for us. It was a timeline that included artworks, included artifacts relevant to Soo Pieng, as well as you climb up the stairs to the second floor. So the entire second floor was about traveling as a mode of practice, following up on the focus on his artistic process. And he traveled extensively to Sarawak, to Bali first, and of course in 1952, to Sarawak in 1959. He finished he became professional artist in 1961, and that enabled him to travel to Europe from 61 to 63, and he came back. And off and on, he traveled extensively back to Bali again in around 1977, if I remember correctly. So traveling was really a mode of practice for him, and through his travels, he collected many artifacts from Bali as well, which was also included in the exhibition as a way in which he engaged with the diverse cultural sources through his travels. So traveling as a mode of practice, I think it's very important, not just for Soo Pieng, but even for any artist today. As we go to the third floor, on the bottom right-hand corner image is the first will be your first encounter with his artist studio. So we tried to reconstruct his studio as, again, coming back to the curatorial premise of kind of tracing his artistic process through the studio. And in the artist studio, and you can see in the bottom right hand image, we included his easels, some of his unfinished paintings. He had quite a few, which we loaned to display here. You see on the yellow wall, his books, including artists like Ben Nicholson, which is, I think, rarely discussed as one of his primary sources that he referenced. And these are all original. The easels are all from Soo Pieng. And the entire space on the third floor is really showing his more experimental works, which happen in his studio. It's almost like conducting mental gymnastics in the studio, and one is no longer hampered by any kind of context, social context whatsoever. It's just purely artistic, purely visual. And we kind of, in reference to, maybe in connection to Hui Min's show, Cheong Soo Pieng Layer by Layer, it was a focus on materiality as well, because that was how and where he experimented with materials that he used, like strings in his kind of surrealistic, organic kind of landscapes. And I think in the exhibition, Layer by Layer clearly also shows meroflage, right? Kind of layering material on one another. So that was really the focus on the third floor, including a whole section on kind of programming for children to come in and imagine that they're in artist studio. So we're doing a few things that we wanted to test, and we thought having a space within the exhibition for children's programming would also be important for the future National Gallery Singapore, as we now have today. And I'll just end with one last bit. For the exhibition, we wanted to have multiple voices, so layers of narratives. Of course, the curatorial voice is one narrative focused on his artistic processes, but we also invited Mr. Choi Wing Yang, who so generously gave his time, and actually his interviews were mostly conducted by my co-curator, Grace Tung. It was quite unusual. When you first enter the exhibition, you will see the top left-hand image. We actually started with Mr. Choi and a video of him talking about Cheong Soo Pieng. And that was really important for us to have multiple voices in the exhibition, without, in a way, to decenter the curatorial voice by having other voices in the exhibition, because Mr. Choi, for us, is a very respected curator and artist, and also he knew Mr. Cheong Soo Pieng personally, especially also when Soo Pieng was in London. So it was important for us to capture Mr. Choi's voice, and of course with Soo Pieng's voice as well. So I'll just end with a quote from Soo Pieng. I think we should return to Soo Pieng. And he said, you have many failures before you achieve success. Right? So I think for him and for me, this was the challenge for my own exhibition, Cheong Soo Pieng, Bridging Worlds with Grace. Because I grappled with this one question that maybe we can talk about later, I unpack it more, is how do we deal with so-called failures? Right? And when we curate a retrospective exhibition for an artist like Cheong Soo Pieng, do we also include his artistic dead ends? For example, things that didn't work out for him, what we will consider perhaps as failures. But for me, that was important because, as I've mentioned earlier, the entire curatorial premise was about process, artistic process. And part of artistic process is actually failure, obviously. But how do we deal with failure? And can the audience accept it when they see a work is maybe incomplete? It's not the quality that we expect from Soo Pieng normally. Do we then include it in the exhibition? How do we deal with it as well? So that's important for me, which I never really resolved personally, but it was an important question when Grace and myself kind of conceptualized this exhibition. Right.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Eugene. So now we'll have Kanaga share some of his reflections. And I think he's also prepared some slides for us. If we can change it to that deck, please. Oops.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, yes. I'm, of course, extremely happy to be on the stage with Bridget, whom I have not seen for 15, 20 years. Yeah. Seng Jin, whom I see almost every week, and talk every other day. What a life, yeah. And women whom I have met and talked with quite frequently over the last 3 weeks. And to be in the midst of a topic such as Cheong Soo Pieng is, of course, it's a kind of a grounding for me. When I was approached to be part of this, I protested. My protest was as follows. I will come in on a disqualification. Namely, I have never curated Cheong Soo Pieng. And I have never written a monograph on Cheong Soo Pieng. I have written articles in newspapers. That was the only kind of platform that was available then in the 80s to write anything on art in Singapore. And my involvement with him, both in producing texts and in producing exhibitions, have been partial and fleeting. I don't wish to completely disown myself from encountering Cheong Soo Pieng. I was part of it, and I delivered an opening address in which I talked about Cheong Soo Pieng in relation to my youth. Namely, that when I commenced with my undergraduate studies in the then University of Malaya, which was situated in Singapore, in the Bukit Timah campus, there was a small art museum set up. And that's where I began my studies in art history with Michael Sullivan. And Sullivan collected Soo Pieng and exhibited it in that museum. And every week when we entered the museum for our tutorials and our lectures, we passed by Cheong Soo Pieng, shown next to a facsimile of a Gandhara image, Buddha. So there was Soo Pieng next to a Buddha image, which made both absolute sense and indifference to us as indifferent undergraduates of the age of 18, as we all were at one time. And then it was in the teaching that I began to deal with Cheong Soo Pieng. But my specific interest this afternoon is to talk a little bit about an exhibition that was staged in Kuala Lumpur. Can I have the next slide, please? Yes. And this exhibition has been written on, written about, turned on its head in several ways, and has been hailed, much to my surprise, as the first such exhibition in which the Nanyang artist, Pelukis Nanyang, translated as Nanyang artist, has been proclaimed as a distinct body, both as a subject for an exhibition, as well as a subject in the post-exhibition, which is the writing on exhibitions and on art. I still am surprised that it is, and I don't think it really merits that claim. But that's not the purpose. What I wish to do is to talk a little bit about this exhibition, if I may. And unlike Bridget and Seng Jin, who have the advantage of an undiminished youth with them, I'm a little on, so I need prompters such as these. So I took a week, mark you, to write all this down. And I'm not going to read it to myself. I'm going to read it to you. So bear with me. I hope my reading is tolerable. I will include certain biographical and autobiographical information because it's essential for the making and the presentation of that exhibition. In 1978, Pia Dasa began teaching sculpture and three-dimensional art in the Fine Arts section, School of Humanities, University Science Malaysia in Penang. In 1972, I was appointed to teach the history of art in this very university and remained there until 1980. As to why I ended up there is an account I have written and published elsewhere and don't intend to repeat it here. The interest is in Piyadasa. Piyadasa, a practicing artist, was a prominent writer, curator, and a forceful speaker on the modern in art in Malaysia and Southeast Asia. He was also a columnist, writing a weekly column in the newspaper. And when reviewing exhibitions, he sharply chastised artists for being ignorant, not knowing of art's histories, insisting such knowing as qualitatively affecting the practice of art and the integrity of artworks. His views were, not surprisingly, resisted and occasionally challenged. In 1975, while teaching in that university, I offered a lecture course on the modern in Malaysian and Southeast Asian art and their histories. It was required of students majoring in fine arts. It was for me, as I'm sure for students, a venture into the unknown. How, when might the modern in these circumstances be conceived, written and read, shown and seen, represented and conveyed as historical, and delivered in 2-hour-long weekly lectures for 24 weeks. We stumbled, we scrambled, and we persisted clumsily. Piyadasa and I discussed possibilities for publicly testing questions such as these, knowing that only exhibitions yielded sites for prospectively seeing and talking on art with historical interests. Although we were teaching art in a university, such an institution had not initiated resources or facilities enabling research in art. Very few still have. Exhibitions in institutions such as national galleries and museums were coveted as promising grounds. Piyadasa led the quest. That's him on the left. And taken in 1978, beside a work that he produced when he was at the height, at the flow, at the full flush of his conceptual art phase. And then he sort of withdrew from that. And that withdrawal coincided with the curating of this exhibition. And I didn't think of it at that time, but it presently dawns on me. Well, he led the quest, presenting an exhibition proposal to the National Gallery of Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur. And the show, titled Pameran Retrospective Pelukis-Pelukis Nanyang, translated as a retrospective exhibition of the Nanyang artists, was an outcome. Piyadasa was its curator, setting out its aims, selecting artists and artworks, and designing the display. I was a sparring companion and a witness, at times a complicit witness. He nominated 40 artists and about 120 works. He and I co-authored the publication, PR writing the lead text on the history of the Academy, firstly as an educational institution, writing it in painstaking detail, and secondly, on the Academy as a wellspring of creative practices and charismatic artists, all of whom were esteemed as formative in advancing, cultivating the modern in the art and art practices of Malaysia and Singapore. My text deals with pictorial technologies and design and the transmission of forms from one artist to another. Piyadasa introduces the exhibition with an exhibition brief, and this is what he says, and I quote them, are the twin aims of the exhibition. Firstly, and this is interesting, this is how he says, as a curator of an exhibition, I go back to Bridget's insistence on the visibility and visuality of an exhibition, but not Pia. Firstly, there is a serious need to undertake research work. Bingo. He's not talking with you, Bridget. There is a serious need to undertake research work on the most significant artistic developments that have taken place in this country. To date, no previous attempt has been made to systematically study the contributions made by the Nanyang artists of Malaysia and Singapore. Secondly, this exhibition constitutes a tribute to the Academy, the first art college in the then British Malaya, and was responsible for the emergence, and this is where I interpolate by talking about charismatic artists, emergence of a group of dynamic artists who featured prominently within the local cultural scene. And he comes back again. The job of recognizing these artists who contributed to the evolution of a vital modern art tradition in this country is now. End of quote. And the second aim. From this, I draw attention to 4 matters. Can I have the next slide, please? Yes. Okay. This is an edited version of the two aims, the twin aims that I read out in great detail. I want to briefly comment on them. Firstly, the term Nanyang, signifying a coterie of artists with affiliations to one another, appears twice in the first paragraph. In its first mention, it is italicized and further set apart within quotation marks. And in its second, it is italicized, thereby trebly underlying the provisory use of the term, indicating it is not a given and it is not naturalized in art writing and art discourses. And that sense of being set apart, the Nanyang artist, was repeated right throughout the exhibition, even in its wall text and in the publication. Secondly, the Nanyang is hitched to art in Malaya, Malaysia, and Singapore. In this instance, chiefly to Malaysia. In writings by Piyadasa, the Nanyang is lodged as marking wellsprings of the modern in Malaysian art and in his construction of Malaysian art history. He maintains this viewpoint consistently, telling it variously. For instance, in a 1971 paper delivered at a cultural congress in Kuala Lumpur, he installs Cheong Soo Pieng, the subject of our discussion today, and by implication the Nanyang, as a fountainhead of the modern in Malaysian art unhesitatingly. Piyadasa's claims are not exceptional, as claims of belonging are multiple and varied. We step back a little when recalling the following. In 1959, a publication on Chinese art in the 20th century, Michael Sullivan, the founding curator of an art museum in the then University of Malaya, sited in Singapore, and a lecturer in history of art. His tenure in Singapore was from 1955 to 1960. He concludes his account of Chinese art in the 20th century with the following as a proposition, and I quote, "There is little doubt that since 1950, the most significant developments in Chinese painting have taken place outside China." End of quote. A proposition that will undoubtedly be disputed and cast aside, depending on one's worldviews. Among places named by Sullivan as fertile for developing Chinese painting outside China are Singapore and Malaya. And among artists he names are Lim Hak Tai, Chen Chong Sui, Chen Wen Si, Cheong Soo Pieng, and I quote him, a young man from Johor named Chia Yu Chien, whom he was very fond of. These artists I named, who are installed prominently in the retrospective curated by Piedasa in 1979 in Kuala Lumpur, and as exemplifying a modern that is vital, a dynamic in Malaysian art. And vis-à-vis this exposition, Sullivan, in his writings, does not employ the term Nanyang in his writings on art and artists here, preferring Singapore, Malaya, and Southeast Asia. And we underline Sullivan's esteem of these artists, whom I named, as aligned with a reckoning of 20th century art in China, written in the middle of that century while he was residing in Singapore. So, the Nanyang, Cheong Soo Pieng are not bound in and by Singapore. Interpretively, they are positioned as marking moments of formative significance in multiple histories of the modern in art, in multiple locations or multiple geographies. Ahmad Mashhadi gathers and appraises the manifold strands in the telling of the Nanyang, offering an illuminating synthesis of the prevailing interpretive field in a paper, a deeply thoughtful paper, delivered during the launch of a publication of a bibliography on the Nanyang by and at the National Library in 2009. Its title, that is Ahmad's paper's title, is Denationalizing Nanyang Modernity. Regrettably, it is not published. I think it should. But as an aside, at that very launch in the library in 2009, I read a paper titled, "Oh No, Not the Nanyang Again," signaling my farewell to it. And here I am talking on it. I should be faithful to my declarations. Expansive and somewhat permissive interpretations by Piedasa and my writing have been scrutinized and appraised as mistaken and inappropriate by Yo Man Tong through close readings of primary texts written in Chinese, and when examining translations of Nanyang in art writings. His studies are exceptional. And in this vein, I mention a judiciously constructed polemic on textual exegeses by Kwok Kian Chow, in which he juxtaposes Yo Man Tong, Piedasa, and I in a paper titled The Two Nanyang Styles, delivered in 2023, in which he delicately threads complexities encountered when reading the Nanyang in texts written in Chinese and English, and when writing the Nanyang in these languages. I move on to the next. Am I all right for time? You sure? Shall I stop there? In 1979 exhibition, it is billed as a retrospective. I have two more things to say. And this is neither from oversight nor unthinkingly. A retrospective signals a lifespan that is decisively measurable, presentable, and historical. A retrospective implies a terminus, a sense of rounding off. Piyadasa embraces all of this. He says the exhibition's interest is on, and he puts it in quotated marks, the golden years that so many of the artists whom he interviewed and talked with as part of his fieldwork for his exhibition refer to. Golden years spanning from the late 1940s until the mid-1960s, beyond which there is the anticipated decline. This is not to say, Piyadasa adds, artists discontinued practicing or produced unworthy works, but that orientations had altered, requiring different narratives. From which we understand Nanyang artists in this exposition displayed a distinct modernity in art, dynamically and vitally. And the exhibition emerges from that premise. By way of an ending, I return to the beginning. Oh, no, can't be. Yes, it is. I'm not going to reiterate the whole thing, don't worry. I am ending. By way of an ending, I return to the beginning, to a view that exhibitions are sites for initiating research and consolidating knowledge on art. Both Bridget and Seng Eugene and his collaborators produced massive volumes as publications arising from that exhibitions that they curated. I dare say those volumes would have been improbable without the exhibition. So writing on art is inextricably linked with exhibiting art in our midst. I have yet to see a seriously researched volume of writings that is produced as writing. And we wonder why. And I still wonder why, after 8 decades. We recall the brief when Piyadasa writes of a serious need to undertake research on significant developments in art. Customarily, research is expected to be undertaken in departments of art studies and art histories. I ask, where are they? Exhibitions entail research. Piyadasa lodges research and systematic study as the heartbeats of the 1979 show. And I add, not singularly or idiosyncratically, but in all of the shows that he has curated. He asks himself, as no doubt Bridget and Seng Eugene and women ask, he asks himself and the exhibition to do more than conventionally and customarily represent and show art. In these circumstances, the making of an exhibition is interventive. Its tenor is mediatory, edging towards new, unorthodox methods for relating objects, ideas, sites, and publics. In those circumstances, artworks reside in such exhibitions questioningly and quizzically, and seeing becomes demanding. At which point, I think we are ready to enter Cheong Soo Pieng layer by layer on those premises. Thank you, folks. All yours, women. All yours.
Thank you very much, Kanaga, and also Bridget and Eugene. I think as you know, we've acknowledged, this is a really special occasion where I think there are very few artists, I think, in Singapore where we can bring together a collection of curators, many more in the audience as well, who have kind of worked on Soo Pieng. So I think this is really worth thinking about. So by way of starting, I have two questions. The first one is perhaps more directed towards Bridget and Eugene, and it's really on this question of the retrospective, which Kanaga you brought up, and you were talking about how for Piadasa it was to refer to the golden years of the artist. But Bridget, when you were sharing, you used this word comprehensive, which I wrote down and circled because I think it's something that it's a big challenge when you're thinking about putting together a retrospective, right? What do we really mean by that? So there's retrospective, there's solo exhibition, and then, for example, layer by layer, which is much more focused. So maybe I can have Bridget and Eugene share a bit about how you approached this idea of the solo exhibition in terms of selecting the artworks for display.
Why did you write that down and circle it? What's that mean?
Because I was like, oh, comprehensive.
What's that mean? Okay, so actually this is a little bit, we need to have some context. I think a lot of people are very familiar with Cheong Soo Pieng's artworks, and in fact, they're familiar with a particular type of Cheong Soo Pieng artwork. Agreed? And so, in terms of comprehensive, I think I was also referring to that I had the opportunity to work with one person's collection that had a very wide spectrum of Cheong Soo Pieng artworks. And then again, meaning that it's not just the type of Cheong Soo Pieng artworks that people are familiar with. So I'm just going to say it out loud. I think a lot of people I don't know about now, I think now we have a lot more exposure, but let's say 15, 20, 30 years ago, when you say Cheong Soo Pieng, people automatically think of the Balinese girls, the stylized Balinese girls. And that's just a default. It's not a bad thing, it's just a default. And so the opportunity in this situation was to be able to explore Cheong Soo Pieng through other types of artworks that the publics had not seen before. Yeah. And there was a wide spectrum. There was the typical stylized Balinese girl, which also that some people cannot distinguish, and this is by no means a critique, it's just us and our visual culture, Sarawakian girls versus Balinese girls. You see one indigenous, type, and then you kind of associate it with all the other types. So there was that, and then there was the abstract works, and then there was a segment of abstract works which we had never seen before. All of this, by the way, is in the exhibition, and it's also in the publication. I think we showed a picture of it. That publication is available in the library and elsewhere if you wanted to have a look. And then there was also mixed media, metal relief works, which that was a bit of a shock to me as well. I mean, I'd seen like one or two, but then to see like a whole spectrum of it was kind of, a bit of a shock. That indeed he had done so many and was relentless, and so he was actually very prolific, and I think we didn't know enough about it. And so that was an opportunity for me to take stock. And that I did say, when I said comprehensive earlier, I also said at the time. And so I think that's very important. So at the time, the spectrum was, how do I put together a show that tells a story of Cheong Soo Pieng so that people can understand better that this was a man who did more than just paint Balinese girls. So it's actually as simple as that. I don't really want to go into details about all the other stuff, or to give you the categories. I don't think it's necessary. I think it's just important to repeat what I said when I first introduce the way I thought about curating the show, and that is really important to reflect the artist's lived experience, because I didn't have the opportunity of meeting him. I could only actually speak to his daughter, Ling Guat, and also just, as I said, pegged his journey, where he was born, what he did, where he went to school, and he was we are very fortunate in that way, not fortunate for him, but fortunate in that way that he went through very tumultuous times, and that pushed him in many different places, and therefore we were able to pick up or I was able to pick up on those events, incidences in history and relate that part of his journey to what he was experiencing and also how probably he was trying to express himself or convey some of that experience through his art of the time. And that says right up to the time that he came to Singapore and then resigned from NAFA. We like to stake a claim, sorry, I say we because I work at Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts. We like to stake a claim that he is the first and only full-time from that whole, from full-time lecturer, because there's a whole group of these pioneer artists who are associated with NAFA, for instance, which was mentioned, Chen Chong Wei, and so on, and Cheong Soo Pieng, Chen Wen-si, actually Georgette Chen, but she's not mentioned here. So he was the only one that was full-time. All the other artists were actually part-time. So he dedicated himself in those seminal years, as an educator. So right up the time he came, resigned from NAFA, traveled. Eugene stopped at 77 when he went back to Bali, because in 79 he went back to China. So we were able to, I think you know that, it's just that you didn't say it. So we were able to track that, and that was the method that I used to peg that entire journey and then to lift out some of the works that kind of matched the experience of those periods, and then and again, as a curator, make certain assumptions. You make certain assumptions because you have done the research, but you will never have the artist telling you, oh, I did it because of this. Well, in this case, because he was not around. And then, of course, the research also involves all... if you speak to the students of Cheong Soo Pieng, you will know that he was actually largely reticent. He never really liked to speak, and I think it was also because some of the students said this, he didn't speak English very well, and the students communicated with him, whether it was in dialect or a little bit, smattering of like Mandarin, but the English for translation purposes. So he didn't speak a lot, and so I like to. Because I know some of his students really well, they're all the second generation artists who are in their 80s now, to say that he taught by osmosis, the sheer presence of this man. But there are interviews and there are little statements, and the research involved that, and piecing it together to get an impression of how you can, I won't say safely, perhaps we come back to Eugene's calculated, well, it's not yours, it's actually calculated risk on the assumption you make when you represent the artist and the work in that spectrum.
Thanks, Bridget.
Thanks, Bridget. And I think it's important that we take calculated risks, right? Also in curating. But coming back to Hui Min's question about the retrospective, I've always been quite ambivalent about this term, retrospective. Usually, artists have passed on and they have a retrospective. It also been used when artists are still alive and they have retrospectives. I've never squared with that. But I wish them none the best anyway. And they live very long lives. I wish them that they live long lives. But when I was thinking about the survey, and I mentioned earlier about Bridget mentioned comprehensive, but of course she has qualified it. For me, it's not so much, of course, about being comprehensive. It's about for me identifying aspects of the artist's practice and uncovering it through research, as what Kanaga said. So in the interest of time, I'll just focus on one thing about maybe a way that we can think about the retrospective as a format, in terms of a solo exhibition. And I go back to Kok Boon. Actually, we really should invite Kok Boon. He's not here. And he said, and I quote him in his review of my exhibition, he said, and I quote, "One criticism against Cheong Soo Pieng's work is his detachment and over-idealization of his Southeast Asian subject matter. Placed beside his Southeast Asian counterparts with strong realism influence or those with rich spiritual connotations, Cheong's work may appear trivial and desensitized to the political tensions, social changes, urban landscapes, shifts evident in Singapore." And he goes on to, and I unquote, and he goes on to cite the social realist artists, like, for example, Chua Mia Tee or, Lai Kwei Fang. as being more directly and perhaps to him more authentically responding to the social changes or difficulties of the common person at that time. So I think it's interesting to go back to this because this was something that Grace and myself also kind of thought about in terms of a retrospective. How do we kind of think about Soo Pieng in this way, and can we kind of bring in these critical self-reflections into the exhibition? All right. So my main kind of ambivalence with retrospectives is that they tend to be, in one word, celebratory of the artist. And how do we, as curators and art historians, as well, go against the grain, right? To also kind of bring out and flesh and deal with the complexities of an artist's practice. Like Soo Pieng, who has such a proliferate artist, and also in terms of his stylistic changes and in terms of his very diverse use of different materials. How do we make sense of all this? And just coming back to the final part of his life, which is what Kok Poon was actually probably pointing towards. So the time when he went back to Bali in 77 and he went back to China in 79, probably this period is seen as more, for want of a better term, decorative aspect of or period of Soo Pieng's practice until he passed on in 1983. Right, and I think in my exhibition, together with Grace, we were thinking about, yes, we want to deal with this last part of his life and not say, let's put it aside and let's not deal with this body of works towards the last phase of it, and let's talk about it, right? And as what Bridget said, his return to China was particularly important in 79 because he went back in a very cyclical way. So he wasn't just an artist who was working in a very linear fashion. He was also going backwards. For example, going back to Bali in 1977 was important for him, and he created another body of works. Going back to China, created another body of works related to the Northern Song monumental painting. So he was kind of constantly going back to tradition and finding ways to reinvent it in a cyclical way. And that happened towards the last part of his life. As well. And of course, he had one eye on China. He was hoping to have an exhibition in China. And we know because he created a special frame, which was a very thin kind of aluminium frame so that he could ship it cheaply. It's not a very heavy frame. So he was already planning to have his big exhibition, solo exhibition back in China, because that was important for him. I think these are quite kind of complicated kind of sentiments of the artist. We rarely talk about many of the Nanyang artists did kind of look back to China, including Liu Kang, Chen Wen-si as well. Cheong Soo Pieng was no different. Georgette, I'm not sure. Maybe hers is a bit more different. But they were looking back towards China for a certain kind of validation in terms of their practice, as an artist. So that was important. And it was something that we wanted to deal with in the exhibition. Will we be successful? I'm not sure. But Kok Poon certainly sort of picked it up a bit when he talked about this, because it was a section that we didn't want to leave out. We wanted to kind of discuss it, even though it was going to be difficult as well.
Thanks, Eugene. Anything to add?
That's the next exhibition.
No.
Sorry.
Yes.
That's the next exhibition.
Okay. Okay, so I think I want to really give everyone an opportunity to respond to what I think is quite an important point that's been raised, which is the relationship between exhibitions and writing. So I think the exhibition is a really unique format because it's ephemeral, it's transient. It takes place in a space for whether it be a month, a few weekends, 3 months, 4 months, but then the physical exhibition and the artworks are taken down, returned to their owners, and all that remains are the photographs that we see here, and in fact, the exhibition catalogue. And as a researcher as well, going back to these exhibitions. So for instance, when I wanted to study the 1979 exhibition, my reference is really the catalogue. And Kanaga was, sharing about how the exhibition as a really important vehicle for some of this type of writing to emerge. And at the same time, in our conversations, Eugene, I know you also have some thoughts about the limitations of the exhibition and how different types of discourse is generated, different types of writing that are out there. Kanaga, you mentioned how in your time it was newspaper articles where a lot of, which was a platform where a lot of your thinking actually took place. So I want to ask each of you to maybe respond to this, what your thoughts on the relationship between writing, the exhibition, and its limitations, and the kind of nature of this kind of aspect of generation of knowledge.
I think this is important. Casting it in very broad terms, it is a defining aspect of the modern and modernity, the writing and visuality. It distinguishes in the sense that one of the ways in which the modern comes about and declares its presence as being distinct from the others, one of the ways, is the intense capacity to verbalize and produce literary texts. And it is during this period, it doesn't mean that prior to the modern there was no writing. No, of course not. But the almost obligatory relationship between the two is a distinguishing feature. And it is also in the modern that exhibitions become the primary agency for publicizing works. And the plethora of exhibitions, the institutionalizing of exhibitions, has been written into the mythology of the modern, wherever. The work that was refused, the work that was rejected, the creation of alternative exhibition sites, hence the secondary circuit, so to speak, the representation of collectives, artist initiatives. All of these were aspects cumulatively that assembled to make the modern. And writing is a cardinal aspect of it. And it is also in the modern too that artists who participate in the publicity of their work. You talked about in your introductory remarks the proliferation of exhibitions, one-person exhibitions by Cheong Soo Pieng. And I think here is another hallmark of that tendency. I'm not so sure whether he's exceptional in that sense, even within the Singaporean context. But leaving that aside, why is this need for it? And the one-person show, the solo exhibition, which then morphs into your monographic exhibition of the lifespan of an artist, which is what Bridget and Seng Eugene have been authors of, both in the exhibition. And so it is in this relationship that writing becomes almost endemic with the display of works. And I will go further, and writing becomes part of studio practice. Artists begin to write. Is that a blessed or a somewhat disturbing aspect? I don't know. And then what do you do with artists' writings? What on earth do you do with them? How do you read them? If you just report on them and use them as the text, then what is your function? As a sort of mouthpiece for the artist, just to report on what the artist has said, which tends to happen. I always tell my students that if you quote the artist, you have surrendered your voice. You have lost your voice, because the voice of the artist is the authoritarian voice. How do you then substitute? As they say, if the artist does not know, who knows? I say, I know. And that's why interpretation is possible. Interpretation is necessary, and interpretation is disturbing. Always. It always is the disturbance, whichever root it comes from. So writing is in this mix, I think. There is an institutional aspect as to why writing only occurs in exhibition halls and exhibition venues, which is our dilemma. I think the dilemma in the whole of the region of Southeast Asia, simply because our tertiary institutions have not developed those kinds of initiatives to study, research, and publish. National University of Press rarely publishes a book on art, only now. Rarely, after so many years. Why not? Thousands of books on economics, sociology, politics. Art, zilch. Down at the bottom. So far at the bottom, it's not visible. Good questions to ask. So the exhibition then becomes the vehicle. One could say thank goodness for that. So exhibition agencies like the gallery, NAFA, do have the resources and are willing to set aside resources for it. I have one question, may I, about monographic exhibitions in this respect. I think, how do we deal with exceptionality? If we say, and I have said it too, there's no other like Cheong Soo Pieng. He is one of a kind, you know. No one matches him. But who do we want to match to say that he's matchless? I have not seen an exhibition in which Cheong Soo Pieng is comparatively presented. Comparatively presented. I know in the monograph that Seng Eugene and your co-author produced, tantalizingly in so many of the pages, when there is the account for Soo Pieng, and then Chen Wen-si says, in this same alleyway there are so many subjects to paint. And I thought, how I wish to see 6 paintings by Chen Wen-si residing next to Cheong Soo Pieng in that very year, from that very site that they visited together. And then we say, who's a better painter? If we dare say that. We don't. But leaving aside, I think we have to say exceptionality is a comparative evaluation. He or she is exceptional compared to everyone else. Yes, where is everyone else? Show me a few of the else bodies besides. I think we might move towards that kind of comparative analysis, even while the focus is on the monograph. It doesn't mean that it excludes everyone else. I think this is a possibility that I would like to look at. And retrospectives could also include surreptitiously other lives who, we who manage the art world assume that we manage a very benign world, that there's no rivalry, there's no competition, there's no backbiting between them. Is there not competition between artists? Competitiveness, rivalry, jealousies? You talked about failure. What about clash of egos in the art world? We revel in all these happening elsewhere, but we seem to blot this out. I'm not looking for a scandal, but a little bit more of the boiling things. Choi, you want to say something?
Yes. So thank you.
When I finish, I finish.
Okay. So thank you very much, Kanaga. So we are running a bit short on time. So perhaps Bridget and Eugene, you can percolate on your closing remarks in response to Kanaga's sharing. But I really like to invite Mr. Choi. Do you have a question or just to share some remarks, definitely on your experience with Soo Pieng and curating the exhibition as well?
Can I say something?
Yes.
About certain element may take not very long, but not just. First of all, thank you for your views, which are very impressive. I learned a lot that I didn't know about, especially from Professor Sabapathy. The history, the early history is very solid. I have learned from time to time, but today he gave me a lot more and very solid. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please relax. I mean, it has been so formal. Please relax, relax. I just want to share a little bit of experience. I talk from the point of a practicing artist, and later on, because I was the curator in the museum, I was the one who organized Cheong Soo Pieng retrospective. That means his life show. Maybe it's relevant for me to say that I become a good friend of Soo Pieng in 1962 when he went to London for a period, and I was a student, art student there. And then, of course, there are a few of us from Singapore, we become good friends. When we come back, Soo Pieng contacted me and asked me to go and help him in his studio with English, not in his art, of course, with English, the title and all that. Then, because we get along very well, he asked me to do more and more about the title, and we become good friends, and I learned a lot from him. Now, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I'm not one of the main speakers, but there's one element I must share with you. It's very important. Whenever I have time to talk about Soo Pieng, and with a little time, I want to share this element. I'm, of course, talking about the late period from mid-60s to the 80s. Later on, I mean, they touch on it, but they get very solid on the early period. Now, looking back, artists, art lovers, everybody agree that the artists that make the biggest impact on Singapore art development was Cheong Soo Pieng. Many agree, whether Chinese. Now, I can sum this up, what Soo Pieng did, in one word. Because as they were talking, I tried to simplify and sum it up. One word, easy to remember. And that word is reinvention. You know, I'm an artist. You paint, and you begin to repeat, Like anything, like you're cooking, you cook every day, then your husband say, wow, this is the same kind of thing. So you reinvent. In our life, we try to reinvent. And I think with Soo Pieng, the key word he thought about, not me, is to reinvent art. So subsequently, we find that he looked at every aspect of art when we have the time to reinvent the art. Reinvention, that's the key word. Now, what does he do with the reinvention? The main aim is, one, to avoid, and I'm an artist, I know, repetition. If you don't reinvent, you start to repeat, paint the same thing over and over again. Mind you, some artists make a lot of money, They repeat, but the the collectors like it. But that's something else. The other reason is more positive is when you have reinvention, you open up new possibilities. Things that you never think existed, you begin to realize that, oh, there's possibility here. So I give you some example. Soo Pieng in his lifetime opened up many possibilities. And I was a young artist, and many artists, whether they accept, whether they agree or not, borrow a lot from them indirectly. So I give you one or two examples. In the 1960s, when he found the Singapore artists in oil painting start to repeat, he looked for a new possibility. And the result is he studied the Western movement and borrow ideas from the Western movement, and he himself started to reinvent with that. The best example, which he did many works, is Cubism. If you look at Western movement, one of the strongest movements is Cubism. Not so much Impressionist, in this case, Cubism. Then artists are like that, great artists. I mean, the new artists, young artists, are inspired by the great artists. But we sometimes forget that great artists also look for inspiration for their work. So he started to look for, once he reinvent, this is Soo Pieng. He was like a madman, want to reinvent many areas of art. So, using the Western ideas, it never written about, which is a pity. We can have all the detail. Another aspect where he reinvented, because he was very ambitious, he came from China, and therefore he knows Chinese ink painting very well. But to him, during his time, they tended to be too traditional. He wanted to modernize, you see. So he has got big ideas. Sounds simple and modernized. You try it. One word, modernize art. Sounds simple. You go and modernize it. It's like changing your life, really. So he looked around. At first I found it unbelievable. It took me some time to realize it's such a big idea, and when he achieved it, it's what a big achievement. He modernized Chinese painting. My God, if you tell the Chinese, they say you must be mad. China produced so much Chinese ink painting, traditional. You go and modernize. But Soo Pieng, in his own way, wanted to do that. Again, I'm sharing as an artist. An artist want to do that, must be a great artist. You want to modernize the unmodernizable. You understand? Like you did for NAFA.
Thank you very much,
So,
Mr. Choi.
No, I just
Yes.
around all this point. So if you go and look at Soo Pieng's ink painting, how did he modernize? He changed them into abstract art, which the Chinese never did overall. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Choi. Actually, I think that point about reinvention and repetition, right? That tension is such a nice way to perhaps invite Bridget and Eugene to share and Kanaga to share just brief closing remarks, right? As we are here, many curators of Soo Pieng exhibitions, have we reinvented or are we repeating? I hope not. So maybe just some closing remarks and maybe what type of exhibitions you'd like to see in the future, similar to what Kanaga shared with us just now.
Are we talking about Soo Pieng?
Yeah, Soo Pieng.
The reinvention part? Okay. I know we're running short of time. I don't know. I mean, I come back to fundamentally, even though Mr. Piedase is not talking to me, that it's about seeing. And if we don't, fix ourselves to really, in this culture of like the internet, and fast-paced imageries and so on and so forth, we consume our visual surroundings so quickly, and too quickly. And, this is what I always come back to. How do I make people actually see the artwork? And we can only do all the things that we're talking about, trying to figure out what it is that he was trying to do or situate it in a particular context of reinvention, innovation, when you actually see the artwork, when you actually look at it. And then apart from seeing that particular artwork is also having seen many other artworks. And I think this is where, Professor Sabapathy's premise is important. Have we ever done a comparative exhibition? Cheong Soo Pieng so, supra, in his practice, and then as compared to, but I want to also put a caveat there. I mean, he went in 1952 and traveled as a group, and perhaps, in other groups of that period, there's the 10-man art group. It's very hard to find, painting or an artist practice is largely solitary. So the context for that maybe is not a very wide berth, that you're not able to find a group of artists who have gone, or a pair of artists who have gone traveling together to one single place and painted the same thing. But you can, it's definitely possible to look forward to comparative exhibitions. I like that. I like that idea of the scandal. So I will be looking actively, for my next project in that perspective.
Thanks, Bridget. Eugene?
Thanks. I think today I would like to end on a more positive note. I realize I have not been very positive today. So on a positive note, I think first of all, in response to Sabapathy and Hui Min, your earlier question about exhibition and text. And for me, I think, of course, exhibitions are sites whereby art history is constructed. I think that's very important. But I think what we need to do more urgently is to reference each other more, whether is it in writings or whether in terms of exhibitions. And I think we actually sort of do, but we rarely kind of reflect and write about how, for example, I would reference Bridget's exhibition or how I would reference, Sabapathy's exhibitions in my own exhibitions and reflect on that. Because that is how we kind of build a kind of critical density in terms of the curatorial and in terms of the art historical as well. So I think that kind of referencing is important. So that's one, which I think we are doing, but we need to do more. I realize I'm not very positive. Okay, I'll try harder. The second thing about being more positive here is I don't know if this is positive, but to respond to Mr. Choi, and Mr. Choi mentioned about reinvention, which I totally agree with. But I have a slightly different view about repetition. Because I think repetition is part of the artistic process. And it's an important part of Soo Pieng's artistic process to repeat certain motifs, to repeat certain forms. And that repetition is important as part of his artistic process. Some of these repetitions lead to nowhere, some led to somewhere. Right? And I think as art historians, this is where our research needs to come in to make sense of all this. So that's the second thing. And lastly is to your question, so very quickly, about what else can we do in terms of exhibitions. And I think there's a lot. And the comparative, I think for me as well, like Bridget and Sabapathy, is very compelling. I think two ways in which we can embark on comparative exhibitions. The first is, as what Sabapathy has mentioned, it is really to compare among his peers, Soo Pieng's peers. And we certainly need to do more. Second is to compare amongst his students, to bring his students. So I mentioned earlier, I feel very bad. In my own exhibition, they were relegated to a narrow corridor. And as a result of today's panel discussion, my conscience, weighs even heavier. I'm really not being positive again. But on a positive note, this is really a direction that perhaps I would like to do. We talk about how Soo Pieng, as what Mr. Choi said, was so influential and the most important artist. How? I think through an exhibition, by showing how artists from NAFA and elsewhere, even outside NAFA, kind of drew from his practice, whether it's certain motifs that he used, that they also brought into their artistic practice. Now this is what we can show, through an exhibition, right? And or certain kind of experimentations in certain materials that Soo Pieng did was also adopted by other artists who reinvented it or repeated it, and through repetition, you also reinvent. Okay? So I think that's important. That can be done in exhibition. And lastly, so the third way, sorry, not 2, 3. The third way in which we can do a comparative approach is to compare Soo Pieng regionally as well. So I can really imagine comparing Soo Pieng to, say, for example, Zobel, from the Philippines, or Widayat, from Indonesia, because it would take another lecture to explain why this is so. But there are a lot of connections or intersections between the practices of these artists. I'm just naming a few, and there are many others.
Thank you so much. I think by way of bringing this really rich conversation to a close, there were so many ideas and questions, I think, that were raised that we didn't have time to address. And I think, the last kind of comments from our panelists also show us that, even if you exhibit an artist so many times, there's something in that repetition, right? There's something in that reinforcing that visuality, showing people, giving people the opportunity to view his works. That is so important. So with that, I really want to thank all of you for joining us and sticking with us throughout this whole session. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you at the National Gallery again very soon.